I'd like to introduce this portion of our program. We've developed it over the last couple of years where we invite graduate students from the field to come give a presentation. And we have 2 graduate students to do that today. We call it the Up and Coming Research Projects portion of the show. And so today we're pleased that Nate Hough-Snee is going to be presenting. Nate is a broadly trained riparian ecologist, earning his PhD with Dr. Joe Wheaton's Ecogeomorphology and Topographic Analysis Lab in Utah State University's Department of Watershed Sciences.
Thanks, Darren. I'm going to start this timer. And really quickly, before I go too far in, I'd like to acknowledge one person who's not going to be on my next slide, and that's Mark Coles-Ritchie. Actually set the foundation for a lot of the work I'm going to present using a long-term and large-scale data set from the USDA Forest Service. So I didn't know he was going to be here, and I probably should have acknowledged him anyway, but he set this work in motion a long time ago. That said, I'm going to talk about a project that's going to try and merge some of the work that we've heard about from Dave Merritt, as well as some of the work that Daniel Saar talked about. And that's kind of taking a land scale approach to riparian gilding. And we're going to do this in the interior Pacific Northwest. But before I get too far, I'd like to acknowledge that this project started when I used to work for the Forest Service, but has been continued on over the last year and a half, basically pro bono with a crack team of people that have really helped me out. So these are my co-authors. Brett, Dave, Brian, and Joe are all here. Lloyd and Lexine couldn't make it, but this work wouldn't be possible without them or the work of Mark. So we're going to start out with a couple relatively big questions. We'll just take it from 10,000 feet and work our way down. And those are, do species with shared life history strategies create ecologically meaningful guilds across a landscape or at a reach even? And then how do these guilds on the landscape respond to riparian and then those broader scale environmental filters, things like climate and geology? Historically, we've looked at ecosystems like this, and we've generally said, why does that conifer coexist with those deciduous trees in the fringe? Why does that coexist with this meadow system with shrubs and graminoids? And what we're trying to do is kind of move away from species interacting with one another and existing together and looking at species like the sedges that may be in here and the sedges over here that occur across very different landscapes but share life history strategies that respond to the environment. So to answer those big questions, I'm going to start out, it's football season, so you always hear, you got to keep it basic, got to just tackle, got to just run, got to block. We're going to start really simply with the basics, the riparian environment, riparian niche formation, the niches that plants can colonize. And I'm going to apologize, I used the North American niche pronunciation. Riparian flow guilds will be introduced or refreshed depending on how new you are to the concept. Then I'm going to take that beyond flow with this example in the interior Pacific Northwest. So really quickly, I actually thought I was going to get scooped on this slide like 20 hours ago. What is a riparian environment? Just anybody, shout it out. Or raise your hand. Or nervously sit there and don't say anything. Oh, it's a stream side. That's pretty good, Darren. So we're basically talking about the interface between land and water. And in these examples, we have 3 very different systems. One is the Stillaguamish River in western Washington. We have Mahogany Creek in northern Utah. And then we have Beaver Creek in southern Idaho. But the thing they have in common is that these are flux zones where water is moving energy, material throughout the corridor, and generally speaking, the interaction between the land and water, where this energy is moving, will correspond to distinct patterns in biodiversity, both within a reach and between many reaches on a stream network. So we're going to keep it basic for the next couple of slides, and we're just going to work our way out. As we move from right to left, we're moving above an active channel, right? So if you're down to the right, you're basically in, say, base flow or something like that. You have a higher likelihood of being flooded, and the duration of that flood is going to be relatively long. If you're out to the left, you have a decreasing chance of being flooded, and the probability and duration of that flood are relatively low. So from left to right, we see less fluvial disturbance, less of a chance of being broken off if you're a plant that establishes, or in some cases, more of a chance of a seed settling out of the water column and establishing. The substrate's going to be generally small on the left. On the right, the substrate will be large as stream power and shear stress change. We're going to see differences in soil moisture across that same gradient. So generally, I should also mention this is not a continuum nearly as much as we see distinct surfaces being built by hydrogeomorphic processes. So while I'm making this simple across a gradient, you should know that these surfaces form based on exceedance probability, and they correspond to distinct vegetation across the landscape. Hey, Darren, can you hand me that glass of water that's right next to you? So let's take a vegetated example ever so briefly. This is the Stillaguamish River once again, and as we move from left to right, we see decreasing probability of a flood. The elevation above that active channel is increasing. Channel is out of the frame to the back left. So what do we see across that gradient on these distinct surfaces? Well, we'll start in the top right. We see stable trees. In this case, we see red alder, we see black cottonwood, and they haven't been flooded or disturbed in quite a while for this river, about 40 or 50 years. And this is the seed source zone that's basically setting out propagules that establish in the seed sink zone as the flood recedes on these surfaces that are then formed following flood recession. So we see in this picture colonizing hydrophytic vegetation. And for those of you who don't speak jargon, hydro just meaning water, phytic, water-loving species, or water-leave, depending on how you read your Latin and Greek. So anyhow, we have cottonwood, we have willow, we have horsetails, all in this lower part of the frame. And in the way back, we see some conifers that have much different life history strategies than the aforementioned species. So why do I walk this down to, we go from 10,000 feet with a big question down to a couple centimeters off the ground. That's to kind of meet in the middle and find a resolution that works for explaining patterns of plant and forest diversity across landscapes. In this case, the watershed and landscape context is extremely important. So if we look in the top left, this is the picture that I just showed. It was taken just off this frame. But as you move across Highway 530, we see several major disturbances. First of all, the watershed was slicked off by logging for timber production and also to clear the floodplain for agriculture. So we've seen agriculture in the floodplain and we've seen logging for about 150 years. In addition to these kind of anthropogenic landscape scale disturbances in this watershed, we also see what we'd call kind of act of God disturbances. They're not frequent, but they're infrequent, but they have a huge impact on how the channel forms, on how the vegetation forms, on how surfaces form, and the hydrologic regime at those surfaces. In this case, the Oso landslide actually dammed up the entire river for several days before blowing out. And then I forgot that Daniel was going to beat everyone over the head with a version of this slide, but Brett Roper and I and Joe Eaton and Ryan Lockteff, we basically put forth this model that builds on some landscape ecology work that occurred in fisheries, as well as some work that's occurred in plant community ecology, the work of Keddy, the work of Tunn, and so on. But we're looking at basically that regional plant species pool being filtered as you move your way down from landscape scale, climate, geology, and topography, down to watershed scale disturbances that influence hydrology and sediment supply, into stream reach filters that respond as channel form, physical properties, and generally what I'm speaking about are those local landforms with different hydrogeomorphic regimes. Once a community makes it down here, some shall enter, only one or two or maybe a few will pass, and then they'll also influence those local scale parameters. And from the paper, we basically found that landscape scale variability, not surprisingly, when working with landscape scale data, explains a lot of the compositional dissimilarity between multiple reaches. So now we're going to talk about how the niches form that these plants will colonize. And there's been a little bit of talk of direct and indirect effects, and I'm pleased to bring you the most complicated figure of those yet. So if you just follow me, it'll be brief, I swear, and relatively painless. So generally, we think about that single gradient I showed. We think about stream hydrology and exceedance probability moving to shape a community of riparian vegetation. Very much true. We also have things like climate and things like logging that shape hydrology and watersheds that also feed back on the depth, duration, and timing of those floods. Those floods influence directly the landforms that occur and how often they're inundated. And then the size and the hydrology of that substrate influences what vegetation establishes and persists over time. In addition, you can have watershed filters that directly influence sediment supply by reducing it or increasing it. And you can also have watershed and landscape filters, things like fire and grazing, that directly remove and change vegetation across the landscape. And I should note that if anybody has like a really pressing, urgent question in the middle, just kind of pop your hand up and we'll try and clear it up as we go. So because we have this complex riparian environment, species have evolved morphological adaptations that allow them to acclimate to the riparian environment. So adaptations, the things that plants gain over multiple generations to respond to this environment, acclimate is something a plant does within a single individual life cycle. And these include things like the ability to adventitiously root. You can be broken off, you can be buried by sediment, and eventually you can put out new roots and continue to make a living. Parenchyma is basically a straw-like structure that conducts oxygen down to the bottom of a plant, or a below-ground portion of a plant that's flooded. And the ability to resprout is always handy because you never know when a windstorm or a flood or a cow is going to come and try and take you out. And these aren't the only adaptations that we see. We also see hydrocory and what I'm calling stage-dependent phenology. What I'm really getting at is that plant life cycles are timed with floods in many ecosystems. They've evolved in parallel. So hydrocory is the ability of a plant to time up the drop of its seeds in response to a flood, so then those seeds can colonize an abandoned surface following flood recession. The stage-dependent phenology is generally the ability of plants to put out leaves, put out buds, put out seeds and flowers at a time that allows them to experience less flooding stress. In addition, there are a few other morphological adaptations that allow you to make a living in a competitive and stressful riparian environment, things like getting really large or being shade tolerant or having really nice leaf resources that allow you to photosynthesize efficiently. And also the ability, as I mentioned, kind of redundantly, to resprout. So where does this bring us? Dave briefly introduced the riparian flow guild concept in his opening talk, and this is basically predicated on the idea that species have several life history strategies that respond to different environmental cues. And Dave and Mike are here today, so they can completely call me out if I'm making this up, but their work is predicated by the work of J.P. Crime, who actually advocated for the evidence that advocated for the existence of 3 primary strategies in plants and how this basically shapes plant-dominated ecosystems as we know them. But not to dive into that too hard, this application has been primarily taken to regulated rivers across the semi-arid and arid West. So systems like the Colorado River, or it could also be applied in any regulated river with a run-of-river dam, such as the Logan, or any place where you have any agricultural extraction or diversion. These are all places where riparian flow guilds are trying to predict groups of functional life history strategies in response to changing flow. So I'm going to give you an abstract, kind of open-ended example, and we're going to talk about riparian flow guilds using a small stream in northern Utah, but using the framework that Dave and Mike and others have come up with. So really, they're asking a very simple question, and they're going to kill me because I use the word species. The question is, does flow reduction mean riparian species with shared life history strategies, that's guilds, do those decline or do those change in response to a flow modification? So imagine on this detrended digital elevation model, what we see is a bankful flood of the blue extent. So we see a pretty nice, maybe channel-forming large flow. And this is selected for in the riparian zone traits that are responded to that hydrologic environment, flooding, disturbance from the overbank flood. So the plants that are there are in their niche effectively. Now, if we reduce that blue flow down to a pink flow, are we going to see a change in the abundance and frequency of those species? Are we going to see a change in the structure of that stand of willow or that stand of cottonwood? And the answer is an unequivocal, well, context matters and we're not sure. But as Dave showed yesterday, in many contexts, we do see changes. If you modify the flow, the hydrologic driver shifts, the guilds, the dominance of those guilds shifts with it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and briefly break out beyond flow and talk about a landscape scale example. So really quickly, these are 700 roughly wadeable streams, EPA wadeable streams, so they're low order, they're pretty narrow, they're generally high in watersheds. They're streams that occur on federal land and are monitored by the USDA Forest Service. And what we're trying to do with this project is actually move beyond flow, and we're trying to select traits for multiple species that occur on the landscape, show up in riparian environments, but are cued in on not just that change in flow that we may see, or an existing flow, or a historic flow, but also the stress of watersheds that are managed for resource use and so on. Things like fire, grazing, roads, logging. These are all stressors that, as humans, we don't necessarily have to worry about, maybe the fire, but the plants do. So to break that out, what we've done is we've used a workflow that pulls categorical and as few quantitative traits as there are in the USDA plants database. We've broken those out, built groups of woody species, and then we've clustered those based on morphological and physical attributes that respond to both disturbance and the fluvial environment. What we came out with were 5 guilds where the morphological attributes correspond to these multiple environmental filters. And the naming conventions on these are actually shaking out in real time, and hopefully Dave will give me some guidance because they're little paragraphs, as you can see. But generally what we have is a tall, deeply rooted evergreen tree guild. You can call it a conifer guild for short. We also have xeric, fire, and grazing-tolerant shrubs and small trees. We also have multi-stemmed, thicket-forming hydrophytic shrubs, shade-tolerant, short-statured understory shrubs, and a resprouting hydrophytic mesoriparian tree and shrub guild. So basically, what am I saying? We have 5 different life history strategies on the landscape as based on the traits that we were able to use. So this is an ugly ordination. All we're looking at is points on this ordination that are close together are more similar, points that are far away are less similar. I've color-coded out these 5 groups, and for the duration of this talk, I'm going to ask that you just follow the bouncing ball and kind of follow the pictures through. So what we see is a separation of that coniferous evergreen life history strategy from things like willow and cottonwood, red osier dogwood. In addition, we have hydrophytic shrubs that are rhizomatous and spread very widely, or are multi-stemmed and thicket forming. This is our understory gill. They're generally short, they can tolerate shade, and this group here is responds to fire, grazing, and other upland disturbances. And if you don't believe me, these are the traits that were the most strongly correlated to this principal coordinates analysis, which is reflecting that clustering. So really simple things like growth form, lifespan, but most importantly, height at maturity, rooting depth, moisture use, as well as vegetative spread and leaf retention. So these are the traits that allow a species to acquire resources and persist in a stressful riparian environment. And if you still don't believe me, these are just some count plots, some histograms of the categorical data for moisture use, fire tolerance, anaerobic tolerance, and the live staking capacity, as well as those distributions, the continuous distributions of rooting depth and height by guild. I've placed pictures to show that each guild generally has one or more attributes where they have a distinct distribution that's very different than the other guilds. So on the landscape, what does this look like? Are guilds like communities? Kind of, maybe, not really. And why I say that is what we're looking at here is a set of pictures. The arrows are pointing out which guilds occur in which of these shots. These are 4 reaches that are actually from the data set. What we see is that guild separation occurs. We don't see all guilds at all sites, and we don't necessarily see a single guild at all sites. So in the bottom left, we see 2 guilds, and up in the top left, we see 2 different, or pardon me, to the left of that side, we see 2 different guilds, and up here we see a different permutation of the conifer guild and that willow cottonwood guild. So basically, these plants are accessing different resources based on their life history strategies that may occur at different spatial places at the riparian zone, but are still picked up in the data set. So what drives that at the landscape scale? You know, I show this big map with this shotgun blast of monitoring data that we're so fortunate to have. Thanks, Mark. And what we built were GLMs. These are actually pseudo R-squared values. And we see that our models show blue variables are things that correspond to discharge or water availability, and they don't actually show up particularly well here, sadly. The negative and the positive are the correlations in that model, the effect of that particular environmental filter, and then the pictures are those same guilds and how they're related to the guilds that we measured on the landscape. So for example, I'm going to focus in on our willow cottonwood. And I keep saying species because I'm trying to give you a picture of the life history strategies. But basically our mesoriparian tree and shrub guild, as well as our tall, deeply rooted evergreen tree guild, things like Doug fir, subalpine fir, and so on. And what we found was that precipitation was positively correlated, watershed area negatively. So this guild is showing up more highly in the watershed at elevation. The percent of forest cover that's undisturbed is also a positive correlate, and it's negatively correlated to watershed fire. At the same time, it's also negatively correlated to a high water table. The life history strategy does not require a high water table. The water use requirement is low. And then we see some channel form attributes like sinuosity and the wetted width to depth ratio. In addition, we see positive correspondence between this guild and our understory guild, which is shade tolerant and low in stature. And then we also see our upland disturbance guild that occurs on forest edges and responds to things like grazing and fire. So in short, what we're seeing there, perhaps, is a separation of the niches, niche partitioning or niche separation between guilds, as well as environmental filtering by these hydrologic and landscape scale variables. On the other side of the spectrum, with a much different life history strategy, as Mark mentioned, cottonwood and willow like to establish on bare alluvial substrate following a flood disturbance. And what we found, oddly enough here, was that we didn't actually have any hydrologic variables that corresponded to this strongly with the data set. We did, however, find that there's a negative correlation between the conifer guild, the evergreen deeply rooted guild, and this guild, and part of that is that we see differences in those hydrophytic niches. These plants have much higher water requirement. These plants also have much different dispersal requirements. The timing of their seed is much different. We also saw positive correlations or more similarity between the life history strategy of a mesic shrub guild that's rhizomatous, multi-stemmed, and thicket forming. And lastly, things can still grow in the understory of these particular forests. So back to the big questions, and then we're going to get me off the stage and we're going to get Malia up here. Do species with shared life history strategies create ecologically meaningful guilds? I think we've made a case, and the answer is yes. At the same time, do these guilds respond similarly to riparian and landscape environmental filters? It's an unequivocal maybe. And what we take away from this is that these guilds' life history strategies are tied to multiple traits. The strategies correspond to multiple environmental filters that arise at multiple scales. And biotic interactions are important. The niche partitioning or the niche separation is really an important component of these systems. At the same time, one thing that I really wish I had time to go into a little bit more was that strong gradients should be identified and modeled at resolutions relevant to decision makers. This is a landscape scale approach using a broad data set. Our ability to detect the driving factors of a given small Huck, like a Huck 8, this is across a Huck 2. This is the entire Snake and Columbia River Basin as well as the Missouri. So if we're going to do gilding, I think a site-specific or watershed-specific hypothesis is very important. I think acting on that hypothesis in a way that allows people to make decisions about what environmental gradients drive plant functional diversity at the scale of interest is very, very important. I do not have time for questions, and I would love to talk to you all at lunch. With that, I will say thank you to those who have sponsored and worked with us, and please holla at your boy, as they say. So, thank you.